evening, everyone. Nice to see you all. Want to welcome you all to the fourth and final installment of this fall's Gay Heart Gains lecture. We are blessed this evening to have not only Gay Heart Gains here, but also her husband Stanley, who's come. And I think if they'd known that they were coming into the polar vortex, they might have decided to stay in Florida, but they have graced us with their presence, and we're really glad to have them here. I think you all know Gay, a longtime member of the board of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, was the vice regent for Florida, now vice regent emerita. Also the regent served as the chair and is a tireless fundraiser, always encouraging all of us to rise to the next level. A million ideas and still calling to say, do this, do that, which is always great because she's got a million things she's thinking about. And the good news for Stanley is if she's calling me, then she's not bugging Stanley, so that's good. But I must say that when I started 2 years ago, Gay was among the first to really reach out to my wife and me, offered us her place in D.C. to stay in while the president's house was being built. So I have a great deal of affection, personal affection for Gay, and so it's really it's an honor to invite her up here tonight to introduce Ed Larson. Thank you very much.
We never used to introduce Gay. This is something new with Kurt's regime, right? I like it though. And I was going to invite you to the third and last Gay Heart Gains lecture, but I understand it's the fourth. I missed one, right? You slipped one in with Rick Brookhiser. This is the third and final one with Ed Larson. Right. And I just want to ask you all to turn your cell phones off, just in case you forgot. Well, I was going to start by introducing my husband, which Kurt Vbrandts already did, but Stanley had a serious back operation in July, and I'm really thrilled he could make it here. So I would like a round of applause. 55. He's stuck with me for 55 years, and that's pretty awesome, I think. I also was going to introduce Dee Dee Petri, because after the last lecture, she said, you know, I have known Ed Larson for years. I went to Harvard with him, and he worked for my husband. Is that right? For Congressman Tim Petri early, many years ago. And you crewed for him on a boat or something, but you introduced them. So, but then I found out, unfortunately, there's been an emergency in her family, so she isn't here tonight. But she's our really valuable vice regent from the state of Wisconsin, a fabulous woman. Well, after the last lecture, Speaker Gingrich said to me, Gay, what a coup for Mount Vernon and your National Library to have the first inaugural fellow be a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. He said, that's absolutely incredible. And it is. So I want to thank Kurt Vbrandts and Doug Bradburn very much for selecting him. He has been a brilliant speaker. I know you all agree that. Doug, does anybody ever anybody ever tempted to call you Brad? Yes. Yeah, I'm sorry, it happens. Anyway, but I know that the last two lectures and the question and answer sessions following have been absolutely fascinating. And Dr. Larson has painted for us a clear and vibrant picture of Washington during the pivotal 6-year period between the Revolution and the presidency. Now, I know many of you have read tons of books about George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army and the Revolutionary War, and George Washington, our indispensable first president. But I urge you, if you didn't do it last month, go out and get Dr. Larson's latest book, which is on sale. It's The Return of George Washington, 1783 to 1789, and it's fabulous. It brilliantly demonstrates Washington's dexterity as a post-war and pre-presidency leader. Sure, we all know Washington was running Mount Vernon, which he did with passion and extraordinary knowledge, and we know he loved all aspects of farming and plantation management, and above all, he loved his dear Mount Vernon, perhaps more than any place on earth. But in Dr. Larson's opinion, his life during those years was not just about managing Mount Vernon. It was, and I quote, "This period, 1783 to 1798, in Washington's public life merits as much attention as those that preceded and followed it." And I think I mean 83 to 88, right? 89. Because during this time, Washington played a key role in the drive toward a strong central government that culminated in drafting and ratifying a new Constitution. And he was instrumental in cultivating the idea of Western expansion. And in this regard, George Washington, probably from all his days of surveying when he was in West Virginia, what is now West Virginia, and Pennsylvania and Ohio, he understood how important moving west was. The importance of binding the states into a single federal republic so that he would one day so capably lead it. Ed Larson, you are fabulous. It has been a great privilege to have you at Mount Vernon this past year, and for me especially to have you as the 2014 Gay Heart Gaines Distinguished Visiting Fellow of American History. We want you to keep in touch. We will be so interested in all you're going to do going forward. And I know you've delivered lectures on all sorts of things other than American history, science, religion, and law, and all over the United States and the world. But we look forward to tonight's lecture very, very much, and thank you so much for being with us.
Well, what a wonderful, wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here, and it's such an honor to give the lecture named after you, because you have done so much for this place. Not just you, but DDP Tri, as you mentioned, and the other ladies who have organized this place. I mean, I came here as a kid years ago, and it was wonderful. But what has happened over the past few years with the opening of the Education Center, the museum, and now the library, as I've said before, this group of ladies, the ladies who are running it now, are running this place better than anybody since Martha Washington did it alone. They deserve a tremendous credit. And they have been so brilliant in picking Kurt and Doug and Stephen, wherever he is. These people are just amazing the way they keep this place running. So thank them. If you see any vice regent walking around, or the regent herself, who I think comes from Maryland, right? Thank them, because they have made this even more of a national treasure than it's ever been, and it's such an honor to be here. Now, as you suggest, my book covers the period, this 6-year period. And in earlier lectures, for those of you who've been here, I've covered the up through the Constitutional Convention. And so what I'm going to do is tell, as that famous radio announcer used to say, tell the rest of the story tonight. In perhaps the most famous scene of American history, the one pictured here, George Washington presided over the signing of the United States Constitution in September 17, 1787. A second celebrated event took place on April 30, 1789, when he took the oath of office as the first president of the United States, which is when my book ends. Now, these two dates, I've talked about the earlier before, but these two dates, this basically year and a half, bracket a time of rising partisanship when Washington, the retired war hero, displayed the same reserved style of effective leadership that would later mark his remarkable presidency. That's what I want to talk about today, that final period of this in-between period, the period that has been left out of so many stories of Washington. Now, one day after the delegates signed the Constitution, this alleged picture of it, and sent it to Congress for submission to the states for ratification of the popular conventions, which are how I finished the last lecture, Washington left for his beloved Mount Vernon, ostensibly to let the people work their will, Indeed, on that very day that he left, Washington wrote about the Constitution that, quote, the general opinion of it or reception of it is not for me to decide, and vowed not to, quote, say anything for or against it in public. Yet 2 days after reaching Mount Vernon, he sent copies of the document to 3 former Virginia governors, along with identical letters urging them to support it. He wrote, I sincerely believe that it is the best that could be obtained at this time, and if nothing had been agreed to, anarchy would soon have ensued. This was exactly his feeling about it. With 2 of Virginia's delegates at the convention having refused to sign the document, and state leaders lining up behind them, Washington feared that the Constitution, and these were the 2 leaders who refused to sign, Washington feared that the Constitution would face strong headwinds in the Old Dominion. As much as he genuinely wanted to live quietly on his plantation and sincerely eschewed political power, Washington had so much time and so much reputation invested in the Constitution and believed so strongly that his country could not survive without it, that its progress consumed him even as he resumed day-to-day management of his estate. Like most Federalists, he was convinced that the choice lay between the Constitution and chaos. The preservation of liberty and private property required ratification, and ratification necessarily would involve him. Now, once the convention adjourned and news of the Constitution and calls for its ratification spread across the land, both inevitably focused on Washington's role as president of the Constitutional Convention. A widely reprinted newspaper article of the day asked, is it possible that the deliverer of our country would have recommended an unsafe form of government? Everywhere, you can scan the newspapers, everywhere, early reports sounded much the same. Federalists would rely on the public's trust in Washington to carry the day. Now, Washington knew the role his name and reputation were playing in the campaign for ratification. He received and read newspapers from around the country daily and followed the unfolding drama in them and through private letters. These reports carried endless references to Washington's central role at the convention. Pennsylvania delegate Gouverneur Morris wrote to Washington in October, I am convinced that if you had not attended the convention and the same paper had been handed out to the world, it would have met with a colder reception, fewer and weaker advocates, and with more and strenuous opponents. It would have failed. New York delegate Alexander Hamilton added that the universal popularity of George Washington was the key factor in the Federalist favor going into the ratification contest. Now, most people likely cared less that Washington had signed the Constitution than that he would presumably lead the government under it. No sooner had the convention issued its Constitution in September than the Pennsylvania Gazette, then the nation's leading newspaper, proclaimed, quote, George Washington has already been destined by 1,000 voices to fill the place of the first president. If anything, the Gazette's count was far too low. People everywhere, when they heard about the proposed new government, generally expected Washington to lead it. Connecticut's David Humphreys wrote to Washington in September, what will tend more than anything to the adoption of this new system will be the universal opinion of your being elected president. No doubt Washington saw it coming and, without coveting or courting the position, never denied that he would accept it. Morris warned about the Constitution's prospect. Should the idea prevail that you would not accept the president, it would prove fatal to ratification. By silence, Washington played his part. Even with him in their camp, though, Federalists faced the daunting task of securing ratification for their radical shift of power from the states to the central government. Now, Federalists did have the advantage of a document designed to address the grave economic and political problems facing the country, and influential supporters returning from the convention to each state pushing for ratification. But led first by dissenting delegates, and soon joined by New York Governor George Clinton and Virginia orator Patrick Henry and others, anti-federalists were organizing to stop ratification, or at least to secure fundamental amendments protecting both individual liberty and states' rights. By circulating their objections and proposed revisions, they hoped to encourage a coordinated response across the states during the ratification process. To stop the Federalists, they needed 5 of the 13 states, or, for all practical purposes, any 2 of the big 4, New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, or Virginia. Whether he liked it or not, this clash would draw in Washington. Well, among the crucial states, first came Pennsylvania, whose large unified delegation of the convention had the advantage of coming from the party that can control the state legislature. Meeting in the same room as the Constitutional Convention and voting along party lines, that assembly called a state ratifying convention even before Congress authorized states to do so. When dissenting lawmakers attempted to forestall the vote by boycotting the session, the Federalist majority dispatched the sergeant-at-arms to forcibly retrieve enough members to create a quorum. The resulting state convention acted in much the same fashion, with majority Federalists ramming through ratification over opposition's pleas for a less powerful presidency, for more states' rights, and for some sort of a Bill of Rights. From the start to finish, the Federalist case for ratification in Pennsylvania relied on public trust in Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Opponents resorted to questioning how much those men actually supported the Constitution and warning that, while Washington could be trusted with presidential power, what about those who would come after him in that job? As opposition to the Constitution emerged, Washington enlisted supporters to defend it. Much will depend, he wrote in mid-October, on literary abilities and the recommendation of it by good pens. He wrote letters out to dozens of people, asking them to write articles and essays defending the Constitution. An October speech by Pennsylvania delegate James Wilson so pleased Washington that he sent copies to others around the nation and urged them to distribute it widely. Send it to others. Get it published in your local newspapers, which they did. Washington did the same when the Federalist Papers, anonymously written by Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, began appearing. And as he came to identify more completely with the Constitution, Washington increasingly railed against its opponents. Their object are better calculated to alarm the fears than to convince the judgment of people, Washington complained in November. They, referring to the Anti-Federalists, they build upon principles that do not exist in the Constitution, which the known and literal sense of it does not support in them. And this, too, after being flatly told that they are treading on untenable ground. Depicting the Constitution as assault on liberty and states' rights, those anti-federalists harped on the absence of a Bill of Rights. Federalists invariably replied that none was needed because the government would possess only enumerated powers. But those powers included sole jurisdiction over interstate commerce, control over the armed forces, foreign affairs, and matters of war and peace, authority to tax and spend for the general welfare, and all powers necessary and proper to carry out the enumerated ones, which anti-federalists countered would prove virtually limitless. Virginia delegate James Mason homed in on the president's broad authority, including the power to make treaties and appoint judges with only the Senate's assent. Maryland delegate Luther Martin foresaw a risk from empowering appointed judges to construe the Constitution as the supreme law of the land. Others carped on Congress's broad taxing powers. New Yorkers balked at the constitutional limit on state imposts, while Rhode Islanders objected to the ban on state-issued paper money. To rile Virginia and the South, Henry raised the specter of a Yankee-dominated Congress abolishing slavery and limiting westward expansion. And so it went as Anti-Federalists posited an elite conspiracy to subjugate America. Washington closely studied these charges and found them both baseless and malicious. He said of Mason in October, "To alarm the people seems the ground of his plan," and soon extended these charges to Anti-Federalists generally. Washington complained every art that could inflame the passions and touch the interest of men have been essayed. The ignorant have been told that should the proposed government obtain, their land would be taken from them and their property would be disposed of. Therefore, Washington said of the Anti-Federalists, quote, "seems to lie in misrepresentation rather than to convince the understanding by some solid arguments." He deeply believed, that individual liberty and private property could only survive with the Constitution. Now, when New York and New Jersey joined Pennsylvania in ratifying the Constitution by the end of 1787, Washington began sensing victory. Despite obstacles ahead, he entered the new year both hopeful that the states would ratify the Constitution and resigned to play his role in the new order. One guest to Mount Vernon wrote about Washington late in 1787, "I never saw him so keen for anything in my life as he is for the adoption of this new form of government," and then added about the presidency, "I am fully of the opinion that he may induce to appear once more on the public stage of life." Still, formidable opposition remained in the key states of Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York. Knowing their importance, Washington was willing to step up his involvement in the ratification campaign. Now, of course, Washington had already been deeply involved in the ratification effort since returning home in September. He had personally endorsed the Constitution to public officials and influential people in Virginia and elsewhere. He had urged supporters with, quote, "literary abilities" to take up their pens on behalf of the cause, and he had helped distribute the results. He never objected when Federalists invoked his name and had dispatched scores of letters of his own supporting ratification. Now, to win in Massachusetts, Madison advised Washington that more might be required of him. Madison wrote to Washington, "I have good reason to believe that if you are in correspondence with any gentleman of that quarter," referring to Massachusetts, "and a proper occasion offered for an explicit communication of your good wishes for the plan, that it would be attended with valuable effects." Responding to Madison's request, Washington at first demurred. "I have no regular correspondent in Massachusetts," he wrote to Madison. "Otherwise, as the occasional subject of a letter, I should have had no objection to the communication of my sentiments on the proposed government, as they are unequivocal and decided." Then Washington received a note from one of his former senior officers, Benjamin Lincoln, who had been elected to the Massachusetts ratifying convention. Seizing the opportunity, Washington replied with a long letter endorsing the Constitution, stressing the importance of ratification by Massachusetts, and offering advice about how Bay State Federalists should comport themselves, and authorized Lincoln to show that to other delegates. Well, developments in Pennsylvania had colored Washington's advice. Early in the new year, reports began circulating in newspapers that a mob of unreconstructed anti-Federalists had disrupted a Federalist victory rally in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and in the process hung in effigy James Wilson. Soon it became apparent that this riot was not an isolated event. The problems went back to the previous year when Pennsylvania Federalists forced an early state convention and then rammed the Constitution through it without listening to opposition. Dissenters then collected petitions signed by thousands of Pennsylvanians asking that the state assembly rescind ratification and began working with anti-federalists in other states to defeat the Constitution. This riot with the hanging of Wilson in effigy was simply part of that really growing mass movement. Word of these developments convinced Washington, and I think this is a very important telling episode in Washington's life. It convinced Washington that victory alone was not enough. He would have to rule these people, and he knew from the Revolutionary era that disaffected minorities could fatally disrupt public order. When the local militia freed the imprisoned rioters, the local militia, when they imprisoned the rioters in Carlisle, they'd been thrown in jail, the local militia went in and freed them and prevented their prosecution. The lesson should have been clear to all, yet some Federalists wanted the rioters punished as an example and actually hung. Now, Washington knew better. For the new government to function, he reasoned, anti-federalists would need to accept the ratification process as fundamentally fair. After having initially hailed the results in Pennsylvania despite the strong-arm tactics, Washington now changed his emphasis. In his letter to Massachusetts, Washington struck a tone of conciliation. He wrote, "The business of the convention," that is the ratifying convention in Massachusetts, "should," he wrote to Lincoln, "be conducted with moderation, candor, and fairness, which are not incompatible with firmness. For although the friends of the new system may bear down the opposition, yet they would never be able, by precipitate or violent measures, to soothe and reconcile their minds to the exercise of the government. This reconciliation," Washington stressed, "is a matter that ought as much as possible to be kept in view. Winning at all costs," he advised the Federalists of Massachusetts, "would not serve the public interest." Whatever he thought of the anti-federalist, and various private letters betrayed his antipathy toward them, Washington knew better than to show it. He wanted to form an American nation by uniting its people, not dividing them. Now, although Washington's letter arrived too late to influence the convention in a major way, confirmation of his position reached the members of the Massachusetts Convention from another source. Washington often wrote private letters discussing ratification. Most of these remained private. Key parts of one surfaced in a Virginia paper on December 27 and were reprinted in 9 Massachusetts papers during the state's ratifying convention, which began on January 9, 1788. In that letter, as published in the Massachusetts newspapers, Washington wrote of the Constitution, "There is no alternative between the adoption of it and anarchy. And clear I am, if another federal convention is attempted, that the sentiments of its members will be more discordant and or less accommodating than in the last. In fine, they will reach no agreement." Now, Federalists were hungry to hear these words from their icon. By March, some 50 papers around the country had reprinted this letter. The extract said about the Constitution, "I am fully persuaded that it is the best that can be obtained at this time, that it is free from many of the imperfections with which it is charged, and that it or disunion is before us to choose from." In one sentence, Washington encapsulated the Federalist position. Now, the sides were so closely drawn at the Massachusetts Convention that Washington's support may have proved decisive. An article in the Massachusetts Gazette suggested as much when it observed during the convention, the Federalists should be distinguished hereinafter by the name Washingtonians. The outcome remained uncertain for 4 weeks during that convention, as both sides, under Washington's advice, given every chance to make their case, unlike Pennsylvania, remained undecided until a calculated move by a great patriot, John Hancock, decided a trick that worked thereafter, an attack that worked thereafter. It was to adopt the Anti-Federalist amendments that they had been pushing around the country as recommendations to the first Congress instead of as conditions on ratification. And that carried the day. That proposal carried the day, 187 to 167. Adopting this approach, other states signed on over the next few months, leaving the Constitution one state shy of the 9 required for ratification as Virginia, New Hampshire, and New York opened their conventions in June. The plot thickens fast, Washington wrote, as Virginia's ratifying convention neared. Yes, he actually used those exact words. To deal with the threat posed by Patrick Henry's legendary oratory, Washington all but ordered James Madison to stand for election to the convention so that he could answer Henry point for point. A task that the shy, reserved, and if we were saying it today, even nerdy, Madison dreaded. When Madison's election looked doubtful without campaigning, Washington ordered him to return from his seat in Congress to stump for votes, another unpleasant task for Madison. Washington wrote to Madison at this time in words that may have also reflected his own thinking of the presidency. And I love these words. This is what he wrote to Madison to get him to come back and campaign. The consciousness of having discharged that duty which we owe to our country is superior to all other considerations. Washington, of course, declined nomination to the convention. He wished to remain above the fray and not appear to be acting from self-interest. There will be powerful and eloquent speeches on both sides, he predicted. The northern or upper counties are generally friendly. The lower are said to be generally unfriendly. Once the delegates convened in Richmond, the debate went on for weeks with neither side gaining a clear advantage. Between daily letters and newspaper reports, Washington received blow-by-blow accounts of the convention. Though far away, he might as well have been there. The truth was that not only at the Virginia Convention, but at all the state gatherings, Washington was always present, a force more powerful for being insubstantial. Biographer James Thomas Flexner observed, Washington's role in drafting the Constitution and the prospects of him becoming president made all the difference. Alluding to Washington near the end of Virginia's convention, one of the anti-Federalist leaders at that convention declared, as he looked around the room, were it not for one great character in America, and everybody knew he meant Washington, so many men would not be for this government. We do not fear why he lives, but we can only expect his fame to be immortal. We wish to know who besides him can concentrate the confidence and affection of all Americans. In making their arguments, Virginia anti-federalists must have felt that they were shadowboxing with Washington, whose presumed role as president made what they saw as a fatally flawed system appear attractive to others. On June 27, the evening stage brought news to Mount Vernon from Richmond that Virginia had ratified the convention 2 days earlier. It had passed by a 10-vote margin. The offer of recommendatory amendments, following the lead of John Hancock, won over more members than expected. With cannons booming, townspeople from Alexandria descended on Mount Vernon to invite Washington to the festivities scheduled for the next day. Before dawn, a writer arrived with word that New Hampshire had ratified on the 21st, making it, not Virginia, the critical ninth state to approve the Constitution. So Washington wrote that day, "Thus the citizens of Alexandria, when convened, constituted the first public company in America which had the pleasure of pouring libation to the prosperity of the 10 states that had actually adopted the general government." Similar celebrations took place in countless cities and towns across the country as word spread that 10 states had approved the new union. New York would not hold out for long. Victors and vanquished alike recognized it as being as much a triumph for Washington as for the Constitution. "Be assured," James Monroe said of Washington shortly after Virginia's convention ended, and James Monroe was a leading anti-federalist, "be assured his influence carried this government." Well, these momentous events led Washington to reflect on all that had been accomplished over the past year. He wrote in August, and I think these letters are telling. These were to various friends in France like Rochambeau and Lafayette. He wrote, which of course was facing a very painful revolution of their own. He wrote, shortly after hearing of Virginia's ratification in New Hampshire, "We," speaking of Americans, "we have the unequaled privilege of choosing our own political institutions and of improving upon the experience of mankind in the formation of a confederated government, where due energy will not be incompatible with the inalienable rights of free men. In a world heretofore ruled by hereditary monarchs, traditional dogmas, or military might, nothing like America's Republican experiment had ever occurred." And so I'm quoting Washington. "We exhibit at the present the novel and astonishing spectacle of a whole people deliberating calmly on what form of government will be the most conducive to their happiness and deciding with an unexpected degree of unanimity in favor of a system which they conceive calculated to answer that purpose. Where before the convention Washington despaired of the country's survival as a free, unified republic, now he exuded confidence. When the people shall find themselves secure under an energetic government," he wrote in mid-1788, "when foreign nations shall be disposed to give us equal advantages in commerce from dread of retaliation, when everyone under his own vine and fig tree shall begin to taste the fruits of freedom, then all of these blessings, for all of these blessings will surely occur, will be referred to the fostering influence of the new Constitution." End quote. Washington could scarcely refuse to play his ordained role in this grand experiment. Now, in retrospect, Washington's ascent to the presidency seems so foreordained to need no explanation. But the first federal election that resulted in his rise was far more complex than it later appeared. In not only the choice of president, but also the vice president who ran separately in the entire Congress. It was a very complex election. And in that election, it was Congress that engaged Washington's attention most. Even with ratification, anti-federalists could strangle the new government at birth by taking over the first federal Congress, and Washington knew this. Voicing this fear, Washington wrote to Madison about the opposition, quote, "Their expedient will now probably be an attempt to procure the election of so many of their own junto under the new government as by the introduction of local and embarrassing disputes to impede or frustrate its operation." Henry was already stumping Virginia to this end, and Clinton's party would soon do the same in New York. Still, at the time, smarting from their earlier treatment, Pennsylvania Anti-Federalists met during September to endorse a list of key constitutional amendments and a slate of congressional candidates who would support them. Washington left no doubt about his determination to counter this strategy by pushing for a Federalist Congress, declaring that, quote, "Nothing on our part ought to be left undone. I conceive it to be of unspeakable importance that whatever there be of wisdom and prudence and patriotism on the continent should be concentrated in the public councils on the first outset. Given the consequences at stake, he could scarcely leave himself out of this Federalist force. He wanted Federalists elected to the first Congress, and he would be their leader." As he wrote to Madison, "To be shipwrecked in sight of port would be the severest of all possible aggravations to our misery." Well, under the original Constitution, state legislatures chose senators, and voters elected members to the House of Representatives. Thus, Federalists rallied to win as many remaining state House races and as many congressional contests as possible. They benefited from a sense prevailing in the states that, with the Constitution ratified, its supporters should have a chance to implement it, and that Washington, as the presumptive president, should have a friendly Congress. Indeed, while his name did not appear on ballots anywhere, Washington effectively headed the Federalist ticket everywhere. In Baltimore, for example, the Maryland Journal reported that Federalists, quote, "appeared at the polls with a figure representing the goddess of federalism and an excellent painting of George Washington." When they won all 6 of the state seats in Congress, the newspaper added the couplet, "Now all our factions, all our wars shall cease, and federals rule our happy land in peace." The trend continued through the remaining contests, which concluded in early 1789 with Federalists winning 4 of 6 sharply defined House races in Clinton's New York, giving them an overall 4-1 margin in the first federal Congress. Senate contest produced a similar result. Federalists claimed both seats in states like Connecticut, with Federalist-controlled state houses. Anti-Federalists did the same in those dominated by their party, such as Virginia. The partisan rancor became so intense in New York's split legislature, where Federalists controlled one house and Anti-Federalists the other, that they absolutely deadlocked and failed to choose anyone for the Senate, and so they had no senators. Yet the overall balance favored Federalists. As president, Washington would have a supportive Senate as well as a House. He rejoiced in the outcome. Indeed, he crowed upon learning that despite Henry's best effort, Federalists had won 6 of Virginia's 10 House seats. He wrote, "All the political maneuvers which were calculated to impede, if not prevent, the operation of the new government are now closed. And although the issue of all the elections are not yet known, they are sufficiently displayed to authorize the belief that the opposers of the government have been defeated." The most famous of these elections, of course, was between Monroe, pictured here, and Madison, where, with Washington's help and advice, Madison narrowly squeaked out a victory over his anti-Federalist opponent, James Monroe. In a district carefully, well, they would now say gerrymandered, but it was before Jerry did it in Massachusetts, so it should be Henry-mandered, in a way designed so that Madison could never win it. The Federalist surge only increased the clamor for Washington to become president. The Constitution's least tested and potentially most significant innovation, the presidency stood at the heart of Federalist hopes for the new Union. Hamilton had written to Washington, "No other man can sufficiently unite public opinion or can give the requisite weight to the office in the commencement of government. Gouverneur Morris had added, "No other man can fill that office. You alone can awe the insolence of the opposing factions and the greater insolence of assuming adherents." By this point, Washington likely agreed. Over the course of 1788, Washington had articulated, and he did this repeatedly in his letters and his statements. It was almost like his campaign for the presidency. Washington articulated 3 goals for America under the Constitution: respect abroad, prosperity at home, and development or expansion westward. Toward these ends, he envisioned a vigorous federal government, encouraging trade, manufacturing, and agriculture through effective tariffs, sound money, secure property rights, and a non-aligned foreign policy. He asserted in mid-1788, "America under an efficient government will be the most favorable country of any in the world for persons of dignity and of industry and frugality, and not less advantageous to the happiness of the lowest class of people because of the great plenty of unoccupied land on the frontier." Although not explicitly designed to lift Washington to the presidency, the original electoral vote system served that purpose. Under it, Washington need not seek a party's nomination nor campaign for votes. He was not even required to put himself forward for office. Electors were selected independently in each state, either by voters or by the legislature, and then cast their 2 votes. By this point, faction mattered most of all in this selection. Were they for or against the Federalists was the issue in the vote for electors. Were they for or against the Constitution? Virtually everyone predicted that Washington would sweep the race by receiving 1 vote from every elector. Federalists effectively controlled the government in every participating state except Virginia and New York. And Washington surely would win in those 2 states too. Even if he wanted to, Patrick Henry could not deny Washington in his home state. And even if he could, George Clinton would not want to deny his old friend in New York. Anti-Federalists focused instead on how to elect Clinton as vice president, while Federalists struggled to coalesce around John Adams. In the end, while every elector voted for Washington, enough scattered their second votes that Adams did not even receive 1 from a majority of them. But he did get more than anyone else, which was enough to claim the crown as he referred to it himself, America's Prince of Wales. Clinton would have to wait 16 years to hold that post. The election over, all that remained was for Congress to count the electoral votes and to call Washington to the seat of government in New York. This happened in April of 1789, with Congress then dispatching its longtime secretary, Charles Thompson, to deliver the news to Mount Vernon. He informed Washington, "You are called not only by the unanimous votes of the electors, but by the voice of America." Knowing that his words would reach a national audience, Washington, standing in his home here at Mount Vernon, replied from a prepared text. "I have been long accustomed to entertain so great a respect for the opinion of my fellow citizens that the knowledge of their unanimous suffrage, having been given in my favor, scarcely leaves me with the alternative for an option," he said. Then to Thompson he added, "I shall therefore be in readiness to set out the day after tomorrow, and shall be happy in the pleasure of your company." They traveled to the seat of government, New York, in Washington's closed carriage, with 3 liveried servants perched outside. Thus began a 250-mile journey that had no precedent in America and few parallels, a grand inaugural procession consummating America's love affair with George Washington. Crowds turned out in unprecedented numbers as Washington passed through the towns and cities between Virginia and New York. Floral arches welcomed him to Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Mounted cavalry and light infantry met him in most towns, and lavish banquets, clanging church bells, and booming cannons greeted him at every stop. The number of spectators who filled the doors and windows and streets which he passed was greater than on any other occasion, one newspaper reported on his arrival to Philadelphia, which was then America's largest city. All classes and descriptions of citizens discovered the most undisguised attachment and unbounded zeal for their dear chief, end quote. A festooned ceremonial barge with canopied pavilion awaited in Elizabethtown, New Jersey, to ferry Washington to New York, which exploded on his arrival. Rather than gain respect by becoming president, Washington gave respect to the office by holding it. With him in the chair, the presidency, rather than Congress, became the face of the American Union. New York's Gazette of the United States proclaimed in large type on April 29, "We have heard much about the birthday of our Columbia," referring to the 4th of July, of course. "Tomorrow is the day of her espousals, when in the presence of the King of Kings, the solemn compact will be ratified between her and the darling object of her choice. Washington," the paper exclaimed in all capital letters, "by the universal suffrage of a great and various people, would become president." That event occurred on the outside balcony of the newly renovated Federal Hall at the intersection of Wall and Broad Street in Lower Manhattan. Thousands were waiting to watch. As one witness noted, the windows and the roofs of the houses were crowded, and in the streets the throngs were so dense that it seemed as if one might literally walk on the heads of people. Decades later, that observer would still recall, and I'm quoting, "the universal shouts of joy and welcome that greeted Washington's appearance on the gallery." Placing his hand on the large red Bible fetched for the occasion from a nearby Masonic hall, Washington repeated the oath administered by New York Chancellor Robert Livingston, the highest available judicial officer. Most spectators heard none of it until the end, when Livingston proclaimed in a loud voice, "Long live George Washington, President of the United States." Then the audience erupted again, cannons fired and church bells rang. After bowing to the people, Washington went into the Senate chamber to deliver a brief inaugural address to Congress and invited guests, perhaps 100 persons in all. The audience for this speech, however, was much larger than Congress. Newspapers across America printed it, and foreign ministers in attendance reported it to Europe. On that occasion, Washington said of the new government, "The preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered as deeply, perhaps finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people." Looking heavenward, he then closed by asking divine blessing for the enlarged views, the temperate consultations, and the wise measures upon which the success of the government must depend. That would be his approach to governance. It served his country well then and would serve it well today. Thank you. And this, as many of you may know, is the statue that now stands at the site where he gave that speech on Wall Street in New York. We have some time for questions? Yes.
Other than adding the Bill of Rights, how would the anti-federalists change the Constitution?
Well, they wouldn't have passed it in the first place.
Okay.
But the Bill of Rights, the amendments they were proposed were both structural and involved protecting individual liberties. They were originated with conferences between the unreconstructed Anti-Federalists of Pennsylvania, Governor Clinton and his group in New York, and Patrick Henry and his group in Virginia. So the key is that they were structural. They would have redesigned and moved power back to the states and moved the national government into much more like the Articles of Confederation, which was basically a league of professional friendship. And it had no powers to do key things that Washington wanted. Washington had written as I said before, long before the Constitution had been drafted, he said, we need a federal government that has the power to tax, to act directly on individuals, to control interstate commerce. That meant hugely to him because he wanted a national market economy. He had a large vision for this country that would have an army that could open the West. Those were the key issues for him. They would have moved many of the powers back to the states, and it would much more like a League of the States. And what Washington does in his inaugural address is Washington, on the prodding of Madison, who had been through a very tough congressional election and only won it by promising to support a Bill of Rights. In fact, as I explain in the book, it's a little Washington during his campaign for Madison during his campaign for Congress. Remember, Henry gerrymandered a district that was impossible for Madison to win, and he knew it. And he also had the state legislature pass a law requiring the Congress people, candidates for Congress to only run where they lived, which is totally unconstitutional. The Constitution is clear you can live anywhere in the state. But that didn't bother Henry. And he thought there was no way he could beat Monroe in that district. But Madison spent a month at Mount Vernon before going to campaign and worked with Washington very closely on what to say, and went out. And he built his whole campaign is that he wanted a Bill of Rights and that he could be the most effective at getting it because he had the Federalists were going to control and he had their ears and he could get them a Bill of Rights. And he even said that I wanted a Bill of Rights at the Constitutional Convention and I was voted down. In fact, if you read his own notes, he had most strenuously opposed a Bill of Rights and he had voted against it and he had fought against Mason and Elderbridge Gerry and the others who wanted one. So it was totally untrue, but that's what he campaigned on, and that's what convinced a very narrow majority. He barely won in this unwinnable district, but he pulled it off. And then he comes convinced that we're going to have the Bill of Rights, but he writes a Bill of Rights that only he goes through what Massachusetts had passed and then the other states following Hancock in Massachusetts. And Hancock's approach was key. It wouldn't have passed without what Hancock had done. With Hancock's approach, he goes through and he picks all the individual rights amendments, and only those. And he says, okay, we'll back those. And then he gets Washington in his inaugural address, and Washington had voted against the Bill of Rights at the Constitutional Convention. He gets Washington at his inaugural address to endorse a Bill of Rights, but only the ones that will include individual rights, to protect individual rights from the new central government's power, and not to any of the structural ones. So the difference was dropping the structural ones. And then actually Madison, because the Congress is so federalist, he has a very tough time getting them through. But thanks to Washington, they are gotten through. And Washington does a unique thing. Washington signs the Bill of Rights, the amendments, when they go out to the states. Now, that's not required. No other amendments have ever gone out from Congress with the president's signature, because the president is not supposed to be a part of the amendment process. But Washington actually signed and sent out the Madison passed Bill of Rights. So Washington was very involved in this Bill of Rights, but it's rights that protect individual rights and none of the structural amendments that the Anti-Federalists were pushing for that would create more states' rights. Another question. I hope that answered yours. Yes?
In the Constitutional Convention, is there any evidence that the participants were thinking about the process you just described? In other words, we better put this in
No, no, you're absolutely. They very much considered what would pass. Certainly, the slavery elements were put in at the coercion of South Carolina. I mean, South Carolina says, we won't pass it if you don't put in these protections for slavery. And of course, Gouverneur Morris and Hamilton were totally against those in most of the northern states. And they says these are unnecessary, such as the protections against the importations of slaves. Of course, Virginia was opposed to that too. But they said, we'll walk. This will never pass. And Washington is critical in getting, even though he's opposed to it, he wants Congress to be free to be able to put a limitation on the importation of slavery. He agrees to the 20-year delay, and he's part of working the compromise out because they are become convinced that South Carolina won't pass it, nor will Georgia or North Carolina. And that's just one example. There are many things put in. The Great Compromise that gives the Senate 2 seats from each state was viewed as critical for Delaware and New Jersey and other states. So no, this is very much, I talked about this last week, it's very much a compromise document, and Washington was a critical player in effectuating those compromises because they wanted something that would pass. And Ben Franklin was. Both of them were key in working a compromise between people, others as well, but those were two people who could stand above it because they were the only two figures really in the country after the war that were true national celebrities. Everybody else was more regional. Anybody else? Yes.
A lot about domestic economies and domestic issues, but Washington's anti-international alliance stand was so adamant. Did he, when it came to Lafayette and the French who had helped out, how did he explain it to Lafayette that he just wasn't interested in any alliance beyond his borders?
Lafayette and Rochambeau and the others that he was close to in France really never pressured him on the alliance with France. It was more domestic. And you're right, the issue was that during Washington's administration and even before, England, our traditional mother country and lead trading partner, and France, another major trading partner, and ones we were bound by a perpetual alliance. So there were lots of domestic people living in America who liked France or liked England and thought we should get involved on their side. But Washington, from his own experience here as a grower of grains and other crops here in Mount Vernon, realized as well as anybody, but everybody back then did, that America's main avenue of trading was selling foodstuffs to the Caribbean. The Caribbean then were the richest colonies in the world, whether it be Jamaica, Barbados, Haiti. Those countries were the richest places in the world because they were growing what was known as, white gold. They were growing sugar. And they had turned these colonies, these islands, into entirely sugar producing, and so they weren't producing enough food. And so they were requiring, that was an export place for American foodstuffs. Washington was sending many things down there, but so was everybody else. Especially from Connecticut, New Jersey, the American South to an extent, Pennsylvania, of course. And so we didn't want to be caught in a division because we wanted to sell our goods to both the French colonies, which were incredibly rich. Remember, Josephine, Napoleon's wife, was a rich heiress from Haiti. Haiti was an incredibly rich country back then, before the revolution down there. And Barbados and Jamaica and all those other countries. So he deeply believed that our economic prosperity, which primarily relied on trade with the Caribbean, relied on a non-aligned foreign policy so that we could trade with both France and England. And that's and he knew there was pressure to pull us in on one side or the other, but he believed in the depth of his soul that that made no practical importance for America. America should be, he was an American firster. America should be concerned with their own self-interest and not some war for revolution in France or sentimental alliance to England. We should be concerned about our own self-interest, and that is trading with both of them, especially in the Caribbean, but also other places. And so he was adamant on this point. And that was a strong issue. It was a strong issue in his farewell address, but it was a very strong issue in his push for ratification. He wanted America, for many reasons, strong enough to have enough respect abroad that neither country would attack him. Remember, before the Constitution, England had not evacuated its forts in the Northwest Territory, in Detroit and other places, and they were arming the Native Americans, allegedly to be better hunters for hunting, for trade, but of course they could shoot Americans with it as much as anybody else. And Spain was pushing in through the Southwest. And Washington had, as I talked about in my first talk, Washington had gone out there and he'd come back wringing his hands and saying, these frontiersmen are on a pivot. They don't have any respect for me. They don't have any respect for our country. They could just as easily go with Canada if they could trade that way. They could go with Spain and trade south. If we lose the frontier, as every American, whether you were Franklin or Cravaca or Washington, they all believed our future lied on the frontier. Not only for the wealthy people like Washington investing on the frontier, but for the common people. They viewed what made America different is we weren't like Europe where people were trapped in their own job, and if their father was, whatever their father was, a farmer or a blacksmith, they were trapped in that thing. They could come to America, just as their ancestors did, and as long as there was a frontier, they had a future. And in that sense, when you think of the three things he constantly says during the run-up to the presidency, he was campaigning in a way for president. He says, when you think of his three platforms, respect abroad, so nobody's going to let us trade. We're going to stand up for our interest overseas, which we couldn't do without a constitution. Prosperity at home and expansion westward. Change that to an expanding economy, the new frontier, whether it be the high tech or whatever we expand to. That's what we all want, and that's still the effective platform of any president, of any party. Respect abroad, prosperity at home, and expansion. And that's what Washington was campaigning for. That's how he couched the push for ratification. He could offer that. The Anti-Federalists could not offer those things. One more question, I'm told. Maybe there'll be none. One more question. Who wants to be the last question and the last of these Gaines lectures?
Hamilton didn't go to the inauguration. He was in New York, but didn't attend personally.
Right. He did not attend. Hamilton was not part of the Congress. He had not been elected to the Congress because he couldn't be elected to the Congress because Clinton controlled the state. So he couldn't be elected to the Senate. And indeed, he had been active in orchestrating the opposition to Clinton. And it was his idea for the Federalist had a one-seat majority in the Senate of New York, while the Anti-Federalist had an overwhelming majority in the House of Representatives in New York, or whatever they called it, the Assembly in New York. And always before, in every election, the standard was that, and this is for choosing delegates to Congress, choosing members of the Confederation Congress, always before, choosing judges, everything they did is that the House and the Senate would meet together and everybody would get one vote. Well, he knew if they met together and everybody got one vote, the Anti-Federalist would win everything because they controlled the lower house with overwhelming numbers. So he came up with the idea. He insisted that the Senate hold firm and refused to meet together and say any person elected as an elector or as a senator would have to be approved by both the House of Representatives and the Senate, each voting separately. That was a totally new device. But he got the Senate one-vote majority to hold firm on that point. And as a result, there was a total deadlock because Clinton refused to budge with the House of Representatives. And the result is New York did not elect any senators, and they did not elect any electors. Now, Hamilton would have been okay if they split him 50-50, the House approach half and the Congress appoint half. But he was even happier if there was a deadlock, because he knew that all of New York's electors, if they were picked by the Anti-Federalists, would vote for Clinton for vice president. And if you added that to the other Anti-Federalist vote for Clinton, Clinton would have been vice president. And by keeping New York out of the voting, it allowed a man he hated, John Adams, to become vice president, but he preferred John Adams to Clinton, partly because, and you read these letters and you just hold your head of how these people are thinking. He said, look, John Adams has such a big ego, he's going to demand something. And if we don't make him vice president, which is a totally worthless job, he'll insist on being Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And so let's let him be vice president, and then we'll be shed of him. And otherwise, he'll either demand to be in the cabinet or he'll demand to be Chief Justice. And of course, that way he got his friend John Jay to be Chief Justice, and Washington's dear friend. And John Jay was an amazing pick as Chief Justice. And he managed to get a cabinet. But not only did Hamilton, and with all these things, with not even getting any electors and not even getting a Senate, he just stayed away because he was by this time political poison. And of course, Washington then doesn't even pick him as Treasury Secretary. He picks Robert Morris, and when Robert Morris declines the job, then he gives it to Hamilton. But by that time, some of the pain had died out of it. But now you've gotten me way off beyond in the next story. So I thank you all very much.
Wonderful. I'm Doug Bradburn. I'm the director of the library, and wasn't that amazing? That was fantastic.